Whenever you open Explorer, you'll get this pop-up window here. So click on New Project. Then once Explorer opens, go to Preferences, General Default Settings. And here are the default settings. So at the top we have some file location selections. So just leave this in default in My Documents. Unless you have a problem at work with the folders that you can access. If, for example, if you're not the administrator, you'll have difficulty using some folders on the machine, or you might even have to use a server machine. So these settings allow you to access server folders. So the roaming My Documents is the current folder, but if you need a specific folder on a drive, you can select Custom Folder and then just change that and select the drive. Next, we have missing data code. So Explorer will allow, provides the capability to replace missing data with averages, means, or whatever you want. Now, with regard to opening CSV files and Excel files, Excel will remove spaces and special symbols on input. So there can be a lot of things in a production Excel file or CSV file, such as some unwanted characters, some unwanted math functions that are still there, and a whole host of Excel codes. So Explorer will strip those out, and you can also specify missing data codes such as -999 or something. And then Explorer will also, in Excel files, will remove empty rows because you just don't want those in your input data set. Now the required proportion of records with string entries for text features. So the default is 90% of the records with string components is required in order to determine that a feature, a variable is called a string variable. This is done because a lot of Excel, people can have text files in quantitative or numerical feature columns in Excel or CSV files that for which you just can't analyze those data. When you analyze numerical data, you need to ensure that all the string variables are removed from the data. So Explorer goes at great lengths to really clean up an Excel file that you receive from a customer, from a doctor you're working with, from a lab director, or someone who works in a laboratory, or someone who works in an office that sends you an Excel file and requests that you analyze the data. So you can turn these features off as well and go manual mode, but you might not. You'll probably have some issues, and there could be a lot of garbage in the Excel file. You can replace missing continuous data. If you want to apply this, you'd have to select with zeros with feature means or with feature medians, and you can replace missing binary data with zeros or ones. And you can replace missing categorical data with the lowest feature category or the greatest feature category found. So if and you basically would specify that these are applied if you're going to use those. Next is the maximum limit for display of input data points. So if you have more than 10 million cells in an Excel file or a CSV file that was input, Explorer won't show the data in the data grid because it was a little bit computationally expensive in a previous version, but we're considering removing this feature right now because we don't really see any problems with the data grid view at present. So probably ignore that because I wouldn't expect that you'd have more than 10 million cells in an Excel for a research data set. Regarding data transformations, you can select that you recode text categories in a numeric code on input, and then the default max level of categorical features is 10. So Explorer will determine if an input feature is categorical or continuous by using this number of levels found in a variable. So if you have, for example, a continuously scaled variable with decimal points, Explorer will read that variable and determine that there's more than 10 values or 10 perhaps integer levels, and then it will assign it to be a continuously scaled variable. Otherwise, if it finds 10 unique integer values from 1 to 10 or from 0 to 9 as an example, Explorer will call that a categorical feature. You can recode missing text to missing category when recoding text to categorical. And then you can input binary and categorical as continuous. So if you have to override the feature of Explorer recoding variables or assigning them into categorical versus continuous, if you check this box, that'll override the use of any variables being called categorical, and they'll all come up as continuous. And for the most part, a lot of statistical software packages will upload everything as just a variable, and then it's just it's up to the user to be able to determine what's categorical or what's not. So you'd obviously have to remember if something has 3 values for like a smoking or a bank credit type categorical variable or not, or whether it's something like age or mileage for cars, or the weight of cars or something like that, or family income, which would be continuously scaled values and not discrete. This next checkbox specifies that you want to use cross-validation for root music. That's one of the transformations that's provided. I typically check that so that cross-validation is used. And if you look at the manual, it's just a different way to perform root music. Now, with regard to statistical analysis settings, the minimum sample size for group tests is 8. You can check that you want to report reduced test results for 2-sample and K-sample. So report only the parametric test results. That's either the Mann-Whitney or the Kruskal-Wallis for K-sample, Mann-Whitney for 2-sample, obviously, or report only the parametric test results. So for 2-sample results, you'd only want t-test results, and for K-sample results, you'd only want ANOVA results and not the parametric results. You can check if you want to report only binary frequencies for values of 1. Now, in regression, there's an N to P ratio, the number of rows to the number of variables. You can set that ratio if you want. The model building strategies p-value screening is 0.25. This is what was described on the introduction video for the new version 22 of NXG Logic Explorer, for which for most of the regression models that are run, Explorer will automatically run univariate regression first and then come along and run the multivariable model. And this p-value is the cutoff p-value that one uses to determine if the univariate p-value is valid enough to enter into the multivariable. So if the p-value is less than 0.25 in this case, that variable would be used as a candidate. It would be used in the multivariable model. This would apply to multiple linear regression. It would apply to logistic regression and Cox proportional hazards regression, but not Poisson regression and not the multivariate normal regression, because univariate is not run for multivariate normal regression. You can skip regression diagnostics if the sample size is greater than 1,000. This is because all of the residuals are printed out. So if there are a lot of residual records, and you have to recall that Explorer calculates the standardized residuals, the studentized residuals, at least for a linear model, the Cook's distance, the DF fits, and the DF betas, which are a separate calculation. All those residuals are reported, and if any of those criteria are breached for overly influential observations during a multiple linear regression model, or a logistic regression model for which the Pearson or the deviance residual is unworthy, then all those residuals are going to be printed out in the regression report. So a lot of times for models with an N greater than 1,000, I don't want to see all the residual values. You can skip class predictions for logistic regression. Same thing here. If you have 1,000 records or 1,000 objects in a logistic regression run, then all the class predictions, if you have a 4-class model as an example, then you'll have all the predicted probabilities of the 4 classes for all of the records that you have in a data set. So it'll just be a very, very long output file, and I commonly don't want those. You can determine if you want output regression residuals to the data grid. I typically leave those off unless I want to work with the residuals. You can print the predicted regression y-hats to the data grid. That's the default. The default value is residuals. And if you check this, the y-hats will be printed to the data grid. You can weight the predicted regression y-hats by the p-value, 1 minus the p-value over 2 if you want. And the iterations for the exact p-values for an R by C categorical contingency table analysis for chi-squared data is 10,000. So you can select 100,000 here, but 10,000 does a pretty good job. That Explorer doesn't really calculate the exact, Fisher's exact, but rather, which is really numerically intense and very expensive, but rather goes through an iterative process to calculate the exact p-value for chi-square. So 10,000 iterations is usually more than sufficient. Moving up here, string manipulation. You can create unique feature names on input. You can input feature names as lowercase. I commonly select that because I don't like combinations of upper and lowercase. And you can drop special characters from input feature names as well. So if there are asterisks, exclamation points, periods or dots, or forward slashes, reverse slashes, or ampersands, or circumflexes, which is the character above the this number 6, or percent symbols in variable names, those are all stripped out. And I commonly do that because I just don't like a lot of special characters in variable names when I'm consulting to a customer. So I'll just clear all that out. With regard to class discovery runs, for the all model runs, when you want to just run all models, you can specify that you want the output reduced dimensions to the data grid, or you want the full output. And you can specify that you want to use the correlation matrix for covariance matrix filtering for the output. And covariance matrix filtering is the use of the Marchenko-Pasteur law, and this is the procedure for which the eigendensity distribution is fitted for the eigenvalues found for a correlation matrix or a covariance matrix, and then the noise cutoff is determined, and then a whole series of regressions are done to remove, it's called component subtraction. So that's described in the manual, and also there are other videos we have on PCA that will describe that. You can skip cluster quality if the sample size is greater than 1,000 as well. You can estimate TS&E perplexity, and the default perplexity value can be set here. And we've found that a perplexity value for TS&E or S&E of 30 is fine. 30 to 50 is commonly does a pretty good job. For class prediction runs, if you want to transform the features during cross validation, you would do that. And I commonly have this checked. And I typically normalize rather than mean zero standardize. I find that algorithms do quite well when the range is from 0 to 1. When you normalize the values into a range 0, 1, they do quite well. Although, remember, the fundamental rule for a neural network is that neural networks really like input features whose values range from about -1 to 1. So if you're going to mean zero standardize your data, you have to recall mean zero standardization never removes skewness. So if an input feature is distributed log normally with a right tail, and then you perform mean zero standardization to transform that into z-scores, that skewness will still be among those z-scores, and it will also be in the data if you normalize. But there is a transformation that we discussed in the intro to version 22 that's available on YouTube that goes over the van der Waals transform. And we're going to be making more videos as time moves forward on transforms and the description of all those transforms. But they're pretty straightforward. They're just mathematical transforms. And the van der Waals scores are quite well known. But for all practical purposes, you can either, for class prediction runs, you'd either mean zero standardize or normalize. Now, information bias is controlled here, and what do I mean by that? I mean that when you perform cross-validation during classification, you should only, if you perform a transformation for a feature for a classification run, you should first determine if you're going to do if you're going to perform mean zero standardization, you'd calculate the average and the standard deviation from all of the objects that are in the training folds, and then apply those two parameters, that is the mean from the training data and the standard deviation from the training data, to the objects that are in the test data or the validation fold. And that prevents information leakage, because you don't want information leaking between the training data set and the testing data set. So you only want to pull from the training data. Now you can skip kernel-based classifiers if there's more than 10,000 objects. And kernel-based classifiers are obviously the kernel regression and support vector machines. These methods construct sample by object distance and kernel matrices during the method, and those can be quite expensive for memory. So if you have a lot of objects, those matrices, if you have 10,000 by 10,000 object series of matrices in support vector machines or kernel regression, that will be quite costly. That's a pretty large matrix. And that'd be about 1 gig of memory too. So you can, anything greater than that, so you don't want to have 2 or 3 gigs of memory for one matrix alone. So you can check that box. For Monte Carlo uncertainty analysis, you can use discrete features or zero-based, and you can add distribution parameter names to the feature name. So it'll tell you what the distribution, the best fitting distribution was on the features that were used. For output options, you can empty the output folder at program startup. I typically use this because I clean out a working output folder for all of the work folders that I used, because they'll really load up with a lot of images and a lot of Excel files and other files, and I commonly clean those out because I just don't want those to hog too much memory. You can remove the logos. There's a logo on ANOVA, on the bottom of ANOVA tables, and I check that because I commonly don't want that in for consultation. Now you can also select the type of image that you want for most images, either PNG, Windows Metafile, JPEGs, GIFs, TIFFs, or bitmaps. I typically use PNGs because they're quite satisfactory. The system-wide results do not filter feature list for significant features. So if this is unchecked, if you run analysis of variance, or you run logistic regression, or you run regression, Explorer will memorize which features were significant at least for regression, which features were significant for a multivariable model, or for ANOVA, which features were significant. And then when you come along and run perhaps a class discovery run on those variables, Explorer will automatically check those boxes when you select features. So for later analysis that are downstream, Explorer will check the boxes for significant features found in a previous analysis. So quite helpful, but I leave that off a lot of times. For multiple linear logistic Cox pH regression, only run the univariate. Sometimes people don't want the multivariable model run, and they might want to only have the univariate models run. Now the appearance, black background, white background. If you check this, you have to turn off. You have to quit Explorer and then restart it. And I'll show you what happens here, because you can see that the screen is in white mode, and I'll first say that I want dark mode and then check apply. Oh, one more thing. For the script editor, you can select the font and the font size here. So I'm going to specify black background so that the working display is dark, and then click on apply. And it says that you need to restart Explorer. You can see it's partly done here. It's not really full. It looks pretty nice, but if you had workflow icons here, their labels would be black, and it wouldn't look, or would be gray, whitish, and it wouldn't look appropriate. So you need to start it. So you just quit Explorer and then restart, and then you'd be fine.